You have now entered the ultimate illusion that makes life ultimately meaningless, yet so blissful. You are the human power source for the machines. Just kidding. The Matrix. Humans are energy. We are electrical beings. I've had some weird conversations with people about energy and electricity, and some odd things might have happened to you too. I don't know. But the fact is, you are electricity. Not you are only electricity, but you definitely are alive because of the electricity that is flowing and keeping your muscles moving, namely your heart muscles, your smooth muscles, and of course the skeletal muscle between your ribs that allows the air to come into your nose. Well, while we're not talking about all those things, we are talking about the nervous system in particular and why it is so essential. All right, so I don't want to go through, you may go through and you should go through these first few slides that discuss the anatomical divisions. I believe most of you should already know this, and that is the central nervous system, which is the brain, and the spinal cord. And then there's the peripheral, which is everything attached to it, which goes out to our limbs. Functional organization of the nervous system. So you know the difference to these. Just because of where they are doesn't tell you anything about what they do. So they could be going to or from. You know the feedback loop already. The feedback loop that says you have sensors. They send a message via an afferent pathway to the brain or an integration center, which then makes a decision on what needs to be done. And via an effector, sends a message back out and a response is made. In this case, kicking the ball. So the same feedback loop. So the nerve that runs from the leg or eye to the brain and back and forth, whatever it is, would look, they don't come color coded for us in the human body, and they run parallel to each other anatomically. So you need to go through the functional organization of the nervous system and see how there is a sensory division, which is constantly giving feedback to the brain. I've made reference to this in class with the short video that I showed you on lab night, that the thalamus is the brain of the brain. That might be an overstatement, but it is kind of a processor, a central processor, a regulator of what information goes to your cerebrum, which is ultimately where your consciousness is. Only on about that much gray matter on the surface of your cerebrum do you know. Do you plan? Do you love? Do you create? Do you speak? Do you listen? Do you hear the intonations and the connotations of your own voice? Do you hear the intonations and connotations of other people's voice? There are different brain regions for all these things. So, information coming from your stomach, your intestine, pancreas, liver, heart, all internal organs are generally called viscera or visceral. Have you ever heard the statement, oh, you're so visceral, dude? Meaning you're so deep, meaning it's in here, it's inside. So there are things going on in here you can't feel, and you probably don't want to feel. Well, that would be the autonomic, and you have the visceral sensory division. It carries signals from organs towards the brain. Then you have the somatic. Soma, S-O-M-A, means body. So somatic division would be anything that comes from the body. So general sensory from muscles, bones, joints, skin. This is how you know where you are. Right now, if your head is resting on your arm, or if you're on your pillow, or where your butt is, if it's sitting or standing, how your feet are tucked under, that awareness in your head of where your body is comes because there's constant feedback coming from the environment of your body towards your brain. Sometimes your leg begins to fall asleep or gets restless, or hey, we need more circulation. A signal is sent back out via the motor division. So motor means movement, motor skills, think of that. And so if it's those muscles that need to be moved or bones that need to be resituated because we're cutting off some kind of blood supply, oxygen supply, or whatnot, well, then it carries the signals to the skeletal muscles and you move, you shift position, right? Now, autonomic is a little different. Carries signals to smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. So glands will secrete their hormones in response. Muscle or heart will speed up, slow down. But it's kind of hard. You don't have much control over this. And so you don't even know when these things are happening. So there's a whole bunch of things viscerally occurring, getting feedback to your brain, integrating that information from both the outside environment and the inside environment, like going for a jog. You step outside in your shorts in the winter, but you have a beanie and gloves and a jacket on. Well, your body feels all that cold and sends a message to your head to do things to warm up. But you immediately begin running. Now it gets a message from your head, there's warmth in the skeletal muscles and movement. I don't have to do anything to speed up, he's doing it for me. So your brain has to figure out where to send warm blood and cool blood, and how much to kick up your metabolism or slow it down in order to stay homeostatic, right? In order to stay in balance. So viscerally, information comes back, and viscerally, through the autonomic nervous system, it goes out, and you would never know the difference. Unless something goes wrong, you'll feel some pain, and then you'll know. And that's the body's way of saying something is wrong. So you have, go through these slides, anatomical divisions, functional divisions. See what I was saying? And just to reiterate that point, 99% of integrated sensory information is subconsciously disregarded as unimportant, which is likely why your thalamus and the diencephalon decided you did not need to know. You are on a need to know basis only. It's enough just to survive the emotions of the day, right? Nervous system. So we're going to have a little bit of a new terminology as we talk about cells. We call this the cell body. We call this the axon, and these the dendrites. There are other names, like the cell membrane is no longer called necessarily the cell membrane. It's called the plasmalemma, Lemma. You have the axolemma, the membrane that surrounds the axon. So you're going to want to get familiar with some of these terms. You'll see ER is a little different in nervous cells. You have these nasal bodies. These nasal bodies are the ribosomes and rough ER making the proteins. So as structure dictates function, clearly the nervous system does things that other cells cannot do, and you will see that reflected in the structure of the cells. So dendrites tend to be the receiving end. So this is the sensory information going towards the cell body, always in one direction. And then once a decision is made with the cell body, the processing, that information is sent down the axon to other cells or effectors down the line. And those target cells might be glands, in which case it's stimulating, electrifying, or by hormonal chemical synapse, those glands to release or secrete their hormones, or enzymes in the case of digestion possibly. So in general, neurons have three main functional regions, and here they are: the receptive region, which also includes this integrated region, a conducting region, which includes the axon, and then the secretory region, which includes the axon terminal. But not all neurons look like that. That's kind of a generic neuron. And while this is one you ultimately want to know, these are some of the different kinds. The one you just looked at was a multipolar neuron. Multipolar because it has many branches coming off the cell body, and usually more than that. One axon, and of course all the axon terminals. Unipolar or pseudo-unipolar is this one, where there's only one branch coming off the cell body, and then it goes in either direction. This is real big in the sensory or afferent neurons. Move me over here. So motor neurons here, sensory neurons here. So you'll see these. And senses: eyes, ears, skin, A lot of receptors here, as you did in the lab, those sensitive parts of your body that you were able to pinpoint acute stimulation. You have a lot of dendrites in those areas. In areas where you couldn't tell if there was 2 pokes or 1 poke, you could safely assume there's probably just 1 dendrite in the area that was really broad and spread out, and probably not shown in this picture here. And all it was stimulated once. Even though there were 2 pokes, it was stimulated 1 time, and so it felt like 1 poke. Now, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the neuron, this multipolar neuron. So before we get into that, I want this lecture just to focus a bit on all the support cells, because more and more research is being done on these guys here for development, during development, and even for longevity of your brain and aging and Alzheimer's. It's amazing how much is just going on right here. The neurons themselves are in the billions. The connections between them have been likened recently in studies published to the number of galaxies and stars in the universe. That's what I'm saying. Lots of connections. You'll easily see how and why here in a few moments, but what it does mean is there's a high amount of integration and communication between the cells of the nervous system in the brain. So along the bottom here, you have astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, microglial cells, ependymal cells. You want to know what each one of these are, and I would probably talk the longest about the astrocytes. The most research, I think, is coming out from here. All of these may play a role in different diseases, but this can be summarized in just a few multiple choice questions. Clearly, which of the below do X, Y, Z? And these would be your 4 choices. You only need to know then that one. So it's not difficult information, but if I were you, I'd do yourself a favor as it pertains to Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, dementia. This all has to do with the glial cells of the central nervous system. So I'm going to go ahead and take a few moments just to talk about these astrocytes. So anchor neurons and blood vessels. Here's a phrase: neurons that fire together, wire together. How do they wire together? You've heard things like this possibly, and you can increase the number of connections in your brain for a certain thing. Riding a bike, running, simple arithmetic that you learned as a child stick with you. You did it by rote memory, and then you did it by process. You later understood, and much like muscle memory works for athletes, these things work in the brain. And eventually, in the beginning, if one neuron continues to fire for that calculation, for that movement, for that whatever behavior it is, these astrocytes will detect that. They're wrapped around it, and they detect, if this is the astrocyte and this is the axon of the sending neuron. It says, wow, you're busy. You need more blood. And so he comes over here and he brings in blood vessels like this one to feed it. He also brings in other neurons. So now you don't have one neuron constantly firing. Now you have 2 neurons that take turns firing. So you get the same message, but one neuron is only firing half the time now because he has help from another. And this way we preserve it. Well, after a while, a certain memory and efficiency is created. Other neurons that you're not using, you never read. You never solve problems for yourself. You like to look at the answers before you try to figure out what's happening, because that's a whole different part of your brain. We're not used to exercising. Well, those neurons, they can shrivel up. They don't die, but they do shrivel up. Their connections become less. And that's why, as adult learners, it becomes harder to learn sometimes, because we've got to stretch those neurons. These astrocytes have made a lot of connections between other nerves for the things that you do frequently. What it does say is that there's a brain plasticity, an ability even up into old age, of your brain to learn new things. Now, it's going to do it differently. It's going to be more difficult, but it is possible to do this because astrocytes can sense that. And we have plenty of video footage you can look up online, guidepost in the brain and astrocytes. And it's amazing that these cells grow towards other cells and will apprehend them and say, well, you're not being used here. I'm going to pull you over here for use. And this goes on constantly, kind of a rewiring. You do have an initial hardwiring, but it can be, it's malleable. It's malleable. It's very interesting. So this is a blood vessel, and you can see these astrocytes once again are apprehending it. So it repairs damaged tissue by getting more blood, nutrients, oxygen to the area, facilitates the formation of blood-brain barrier, regulates the external environment. So astrocytes are pretty important. Oligodendrocytes myelinate the nerves. We'll talk more about that later. These Schwann cells help firing to go faster. Microglial act as phagocytes. So your brain has to have such a sterile environment, and we have that blood-brain barrier, but nonetheless, there are some clever disease-causing prions and virons and viruses that get in there and just damage cells that could go bad. You have microglial cells, micro, the very small glial cells that roam around your brain, seeking whom they may devour to clean up and keep it kind of clear of debris that will get in the way. Connected, I believe, also with Alzheimer's. When these guys are not present or they're not doing their job, bad cells live and they clutter the system, and it makes processing more difficult. Ependymal cells line the cavities. So you have fluid in here, cerebrospinal fluid. These cilia keep beating and they let things pass in through and across. If we get in closely, here's a couple other glial cells. This is not of the central nervous system as these four are, but of the peripheral nervous system, PNS. So you have the cell body, and they're surrounded by these satellite cells. Satellite in the sense that they orbit around. So they support the cell bodies. They help feed it and give it nutrients because it is always firing and integrating information. And then you have these Schwann cells. And again, excuse me, Schwann cells myelinate certain axons, and they help speed up by insulating. So if you know anything about electricity, red wires, the black wires, the green wires, which one should I cut? We're going to blow the place up. They're insulated with different colors, so we know if they're positive, negative, or ground. But what's the whole point of even having the rubber around that copper wire? It's to keep the electrons flowing through that wire as close to that wire as possible so they can go in one direction. If they weren't insulated, the electricity could fray off, they spark, and you lose juice down the end of the line, right? And of course, you can get shocked. It's a safety thing. This is kind of like that rubber that makes sure the axon is insulated, that the electricity flows down that axon as fast as it can. And sometimes it even hops between these, what we call nodes of Ranvier. And we'll see those as well in the anatomy. So this is an internode. So let's go through, oh no, this is not the slide, I'm sorry. So go through the anatomy. But again, the dendrites, the cell body. One thing I didn't point out earlier, but you do want to know, is the axon hillock. This is a very important area right in here between the cell body and the axon. This is where the decision is made to send the signal or not. You want to know about the internodes, the Schwann cells, the nodes of Ranvier, and the neurolemma. That is the myelin sheath and how this works. I'm going to pause briefly here. All right, I paused. You didn't. So I'm about done. I'm going to wrap this one up. Again, we have white matter is the myelinated parts of the nervous system. Gray matter is non-myelinated. Gray matter is matter. Specific neuron components grouped together. So what we call nuclei, and you'll hear that term a lot when it comes to brain science and neurons, but nuclei simply mean clusters of these neuron cell bodies. So you have a lot of cell bodies all together in a cluster. Seems to be an area of high integration of information that lights up a lot under certain activities. When we do these MRIs or CAT scans, we call it nuclei. It's just a locus, a single localized area of the brain. Tracts, bundles of axons all going to the same area. And then we have ganglia and nerves of the peripheral nervous system, clusters of neuron cell bodies, and bundles of axons, but in the PNS. So nuclei and tracts are in the central nervous system, ganglia and nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Each do fairly the same function in different parts of the anatomical body. So from this point, we're going to get into neurotransmitters, synapses, electrical synapses. I'm only going to cover about 2 more slides. I'm not going to go through details of this one yet. I'm just going to go ahead and talk about the structural types of synapses. So now that we have a general idea of the anatomy of the neuron, we know this is axon terminals. As one neuron talks to another neuron, you can see this one is receiving information here in the receiving end and sending information out here. We would call this then an interneuron. And this is what a lot of your brain is, interneurons. This comes from the peripheral nervous system possibly. This goes back out through the peripheral nervous system. And this would be the processing in between that's in the brain. So we call it an interneuron or associated neurons. What I want to show you here before my voice goes out are the kinds of connections. Axosomatic. So this axon is directly tied into the cell body. That's going to have a lot of control. Axodendritic, where the axon is attached to the dendrite, that's going to cause a local stimulus, if strong enough, and if supported by other axodendritic connections, may cause the integration center to send a signal. That's why I say this one, that's axosomatic, has a very high connection. It's talking, so to speak, electrically directly to the cell body. It will take less of these to communicate a message than it would axodendritic neurons. Just because that message must reach a threshold to travel down and get to the axon hillock, where that signal will be propagated. And then you have an axonic, one axon attached to another axon. This is pretty crazy. It's a lot of regulation. But let's say integrated information, a decision is made to send that signal. Well, another neuron may override it simply by communicating here and halting that message. Likewise, it could be something that's speeding it up or telling it to send quicker. So various reasons, but you have multiple connections. So these are just 4 neurons here, but look at how many connections you have. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And this is a very generic picture. There's typically hundreds and can be up to thousands of neurons all connected to the body or the dendrites. So when I talk about as many connections in the brain as there are stars in the sky, it's phenomenal. So an electrical synapse is a synapse that occurs, that's what you call when one neuron talks to the other neuron. So this is a chemical synapse right here. Chemical synapse is when one neuron releases a neurotransmitter, a chemical that has to diffuse across a small distance and then link to the other cell or dendrite of the postsynaptic membrane. That's a chemical synapse. Electrical synapse occurs between cells that are electrically coupled by a gap junctions. That's different. So here you'll notice there's no diffusion, no chemical released in between, but whatever was inside this axon terminal will directly move straight into the next neuron by way of these gap junctions. So they're kind of like tunnels between the two cells. So it's always electrical, therefore it's much faster than an electrical synapse, which itself is very fast, but nonetheless a measurable speed difference. Okay, so go ahead and this is up through slide 20, and I'll call this the end of lecture 1. Again, we went through the general anatomy of the neuron. Here we talked about dendrites, the receiving end, the cell body, the axon. Those talked about the different kinds of neurons, typically, or namely, the glial cells and some of their functions like the astrocyte, the myelin sheath, and the Schwann cells that surround them, the various types of synapses that are there, and then just the overall difference between anatomical and functional organization of the nervous system. Hope that helps to get a start. So we'll come back with the biochemical, electrochemical lecture tomorrow night.